This presentation is going to share information about farming in the United States. Most of the information is going to contain farming about the Central Plains in the United States, which has large fields and big crops and large machinery. If you're going to look at farming on the East and West Coast, it's much different with smaller fields, smaller machinery, and they tend to raise crops a little bit more than fruits and nuts and other berries. We're going to take a look at 4 different parts of farming in the United States. The first area we'll look at is going to be look at the crops that they raise. In the Central Plains, we generally raise large crops in big fields. You can see over here at the top picture you have corn, and it's raised in rows, and it's planted usually in April and May and then harvested in September, October, and November. Over here you see some soybeans in the middle picture, and those are also planted in May and June and then harvested in October and November, sometimes even December. And then we also have milo, which is not pictured here, but it's raised very similar over the summers in the United States. And then you have wheat. Now, wheat is much different in the United States. We plant hard red winter wheat, which is planted in October, and sometimes even September and October. So it's planted in the fall, and then it starts growing and greens up a little bit, and then it just stays at that small, maybe a few inches tall, all the way through the winter. And then the harvest actually takes place starting in Texas, usually in April, and then they move up to the Oklahoma into May, and they come into Kansas in June, and go up in Nebraska and the North and South Dakota in July, and they end up in Canada in August. And there's actually farm crews and harvest crews that follow it all the way from Texas all the way up. And then you also have on the East Coast more in Florida, and then in California on the West Coast you have citrus fruits and other smaller vegetables. One thing unique to the United States is the amount of irrigation. We don't get as much water in certain parts of the country, and so we have to irrigate our crops. And that simply means we're going to take water from underground. We're going to use a well to pull that water up out of the ground, and then we're going to pump it into central irrigation pivots. And that's what you see up here. In the top picture you can see the pivot. It has wheels, and then the water is shooting all over the crops itself. And you can see in the second picture, you can see a long pivot. You can see they basically go in circles, and you can see those circles on the next picture. If you fly in an airplane, parts of the central United States looks like somebody has drawn little circles all over the place because all those pivots follow around and irrigate those crops. In other parts of the country, they also irrigate. They use and they fill up large canals, and you actually sign up to get the water on a certain day, and they pull water from maybe a nearby river, and then they pump it into these canals, and they pump it to the farmer, and he gets to irrigate for the day. That's more in Arizona and parts of Utah and some of the southwestern part of the United States. Then you also have machinery. With machinery, what you have is we have to first of all prepare to plant the crop. And you can see in the top picture, that's a guy using a disc. So these are our tractors, you can see, and then behind him is an implement called a disc. You can see over on the left side of that picture that the land has already been turned over, so you kind of make it, scratch it. And then over here you can see in front of the tractor is an area where it hasn't been disked yet. So he needs to turn that over and get it fresh. Over here on the next picture down, the right one, this guy's using a plow. You can see on the right side, that's where the wheat was growing. On the left side, that's where he's already plowed. And so this actually picks up the dirt, turns it over so that they can go in here and plant. Then you see the next guys, they're planting. So the guy on the left side, he's planting wheat. You can see the small little cylinders on the bottom of there. And then he is actually putting the seed into the ground. If you notice over on the left side of the tractor, that little line that he's drawing that so he knows when he turns around where to follow. And then over here you can see this guy, has a long planter, and he's using it to plant corn. And corn's planted a little bit differently than wheat in the United States, and we use a little different planter. It looks like a really wide planter too, hard to go down the road. So what will happen is in order for him to go down the road, he'll actually fold up the planter electronically using some gears and levers so that he can go down the road, because that's too big to go down the road, but it works perfect when you're in the field. Then it's time to harvest. So now, let's say for instance on the top picture you see wheat, and so wheat is going to be harvested in June, and you see a large combine. He's going to take all the wheat and put it into this bin at the top of that's the black thing on the top of the combine. Then you see the auger. That's what's sticking out over here to the right of the harvester. And then he's going to dump it into a grain cart. That's the red grain cart you see being pulled by the green tractor. Because we need to get the grain out of the field into the grain cart. Then you see in the next picture you've got a grain cart. He's going to take the grain, he's going to put it into a semi-truck. You probably see some big trucks in your town. Then that truck is going to drive all the way to the nearest town, and he's going to dump it into one of these big elevators you see on the bottom of the picture. And then they basically will store it there, they'll dry it there, they'll keep it there, and then they'll send it to another town. Maybe they'll send it to another country, maybe they'll send it to another part of the United States. Sometimes they even use railroad. You can see the railroad tracks coming in there. Sometimes they'll put grain in railroads and send it to the next place. Then on farms, obviously, sometimes you also have animals and livestock. Probably the biggest two in the United States are cattle and pigs. You can see over here a picture of cattle. These are just in what we call a pasture. So they're just grazing, and they're using, hopefully it's raining in the area and the grass grows and the cattle can eat it. And you can see they also have calves. You can see the smaller calves. Then down here in the middle picture, you can see what we call a feedlot. Sometimes we confine the cattle to a certain area. Like this little area you see, that's all the place that cattle gets to go. So how do they get their food if you know there's nothing growing there? So a tractor will come along this trough that's in the front of these cattle, and he'll dump grain in there so they can eat. Then we have pigs, and these pigs are in what we call a confinement. They're confined to a small little pen, and they raise pigs that way as well. They bring them in when they're really little, and they grow them up till they're about 200 pounds, and then they will come down this alley, and they'll put them into a truck, and they'll take them to the nearest slaughterhouse. They usually feed them grain, sometimes all kinds of different additives as well, so that they can grow faster and get bigger. And we also have livestock, chickens and sheep. The chickens you can see on the bottom picture here, they're also in confinement, so they're in these huge pens in these large, massive buildings where they grow these chickens all the way from little on up, and then when they get big enough, they'll haul them and to be butchered as well. And obviously then we also see the sheep. Sheep are generally in pastures. They don't usually put them in confinement because sheep don't really handle being in confinement very well. So they're usually raised just in fields like this that you can see as well. And obviously once in a while they can shear them and use their wool, but then they can also butcher them for their meat as well. And that's a little bit of an introduction to all of the livestock and the machinery and the irrigation and the crops that are grown in the United States. So if you have any questions, ask Ms. Friesen.